Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone and thank you for attending today's webcast, Managing Autodesk Inventor Content Center with Autodesk Vault. Our presenter today is Forrest Judd. He is a Senior Consulting Engineer with Hagerman & Company. Before we begin, I'll let you know that you are in listening only mode. If you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the question panel, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. And there will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation today. There will be a short survey as we close down at the end that we ask for you to take a few moments to fill that out for us. It's helpful. It's just 4 questions. Also, everyone registered will receive a follow-up email tomorrow, which will contain a link for the recording of today's presentation. I'll go ahead and hand things off to Forrest now.
All right, thanks, and good morning / afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. Our topic today, again, is management of Autodesk Inventor Content Center libraries with Autodesk Vault. So I thought we would start by reviewing what the Content Center is, kind of an explanation of it, because you know, a lot of people don't quite understand all the details of Inventor's Content Center and exactly how it works, because there's multiple parts to it. Then we'll talk about the pros and cons of managing the Content Center with and without Vault, right? Because there are definitely pros and cons. There's no, you know, guaranteed right solution for every environment. We'll talk about configuring, how to configure Inventor for using the Content Center, the various settings you might have to change. And then we'll talk about something that's relatively new here within the last month or so, the update to Vault 2021, the first update, that allows and adds some functionality that you may be tempted to use, maybe with Content Center files, but maybe isn't a great idea, and we'll talk about that too. So at least you know what it is and what the risks are. And as Ashley said, you can ask questions in the question pane of GoToWebinar, and I'll keep an eye on those as we go and either answer them in context during the presentation or afterward. So let's start by talking about the Content Center and what it is. So there are really sort of 2 halves to the Content Center in my mind. The first is the collection of libraries. The Content Center libraries. These are what hold the definitions of the various Content Center components. It's a combination of an Inventor file template, a part template. Content Center always houses Inventor files. Technically, I think it can have features too, no assemblies for sure. But it's going to be a template file and a table that has information about the various iterations. A Content Center family is a lot like an iPart, where you have essentially a part definition and a table that explains how it could vary. And there are 2 fundamental types of libraries with Inventor Content Center. You have your standard libraries, which are always read-only. These are the libraries that come with the software. And then you have the option for custom libraries as well. So these are the either completely custom, where you create an empty library and start publishing components to it, or you might copy a standard read-only library to a custom library and then start editing those previously standard read-only components. The most common example would be to maybe add a column to a family table for your internal part numbers, or to maybe add iterations to a standard family table that you might buy that aren't in the standard library, or maybe take some things out. So there's a lot going on with the libraries, but the other half of the Content Center would be the collection of the instantiated components. The when you actually place a Content Center file, those things go into a folder somewhere, or actually a collection of folders on your computer. And these instantiated files, they are part files that an Inventor assembly might reference. And it's essentially just a given row of the table with the assigned parameters. And these components too can be either standard or custom. A standard instantiated Content Center file will go into the predefined Content Center file location, whereas a custom instantiated Content Center file will go somewhere in your Inventor workspace, which is defined by your Inventor project file. So when you talk about the Content Center, and when I'm talking with users about the Content Center, I'm always curious if we're talking about the Content Center library, or if we're talking about maybe the Content Center files that have been placed into assemblies. Right. Now, I want to take a look at this quickly, just to show you sort of in context some more of this. So out of the box, a default install of Inventor, when you choose to install the content libraries, because that's an option, you will see a collection of files in your program data folder based on the version of Inventor that you're using. So in this case, we're talking about 2021. There's a Content Center folder, libraries, and inside that, you'll see a bunch of files that are extension .idcl. These are the Inventor desktop content libraries. And that's one way to manage the libraries with Inventor, is to have Inventor manage those. These are actually just SQLite databases. It is technically possible with a SQLite browser to open up one of these IDCL files. You're not going to get a whole lot out of it, I would say. It is relational. The structure is, I haven't personally spent a lot of time trying to figure out the structure. But if you open up one of these guys with a SQLite browser, for example, like just an open source one I have, you can see there are a bunch of tables in here, and technically all the data is in here. But this is definitely not the way you want to edit one of these things, right? Inventor itself has an editor for the Content Center where you can explore this information. We could look at the properties of this family, or even review the family table. We're looking at a standard library right now, so everything is read-only, right? But this is by far much more intelligible than something like one of the SQLite databases directly. So, but if for whatever reason you would, for some reason, need to go and dig directly into the data and you're using Inventor managed technically, there is a way to interpret those IDCL files. Now, in terms of where these files are, again, by default, they're in your program files or program data folder, I should say. You can always see where your Inventor installation is trying to find these things in the application options. There's a Content Center tab, and you'll see under access options, you can say either Inventor is managing these things and here's where the library should be found, or we'll get to in a minute, your Autodesk Vault server could also be managing these libraries. Now notice you can redirect the path of the libraries here. And this can be any folder anywhere, including a network share, right? And we're going to talk about in a minute the pros and cons of managing these things locally versus managing them on a network share versus managing them, say, via the Vault server. We'll talk about the pros and cons of those in a minute. But again, this is where the libraries are found. This is the first half of the Content Center. The other half of the Content Center is where do the instantiated Content Center files actually go? Now, that location, by default, completely out of the box, is going to be dictated by your default Content Center files location on the File tab of the application options. And you'll notice by default, it's going into your Documents folder, in a folder called Inventor, Content Center files, and then like our 2021, for example. Again, notice you can redirect this anywhere, including a network location. Now, historically, without using something like Vault, if you also use the Content Center, this default location can be a problem. If you're not familiar with how the Content Center works, especially as a new user, you may start using it. Oh, it's great. I can put fasteners in my assemblies now. I don't have to draw them or download them from somewhere. Maybe you're storing all of your actual made items or your custom components, the things you actually model and draw. Maybe you're putting those on a network share so they get backed up. But if you don't know where this location is, you may not realize part of your Inventor assemblies are actually still living on your computer. And then either when someone goes to use one of your assemblies and they don't have access to your Documents folder, they're missing a bunch of parts, or even worse, you get a new computer, your old computer goes away, IT takes it somewhere, maybe even wipes the hard drive. Then you go to open an assembly from the network and suddenly you're missing half your parts because they were on your old hard drive in your old Documents folder and maybe they're gone forever. And that's not necessarily trivial to clean up. It can be kind of painful. So it is important to know where these things are going. So if I start a brand new assembly and I go to Place from Content Center and choose a component, notice I always have the option when I place a Content Center component to place as standard or as custom. When I place as standard, it's going to go into that location in either specified by my application options, again on the File tab, this is where the actual referenced part files go, or as specified by my project file, because Inventor project files can also override the location where the instantiated part files are placed when they're placed from the Content Center. So in this case, because I have this project file active, and this project file says they should go relative to the project file location, that's what the dot backslash at the beginning of the path means. This is going to go into a folder called Vault Mobile Workspace Content Center Files. And so if I go to that location, we should see this fastener that I just placed and maybe another one in here. So it's not always trivial to determine where these files are going if you're not using something like Vault, or even if you are using Vault, where your local copy might be going. So if someone comes to me and says, I'm having a problem with my Content Center files, the first thing I do is I would go to the projects and see, are they overriding where they're being placed via their project file? That's the first step. If it says default, then I would make sure and go to the application options and determine where the Content Center files are being placed. And then I would make sure that the files are actually in that location. That would be if you're having trouble with, say, an assembly resolving to the Content Center files. If you're having a problem actually placing content, so we go place from Content Center and this is empty, well, that's where you would look at the application options and make sure which version, which type of management is going on here, Inventor Desktop Content or Vault Server, and then make sure that the libraries are actually in this location or the Vault Server actually has these things associated. Okay, so now that we've got the basics of how the Content Center works out of the way, let's talk about the two fundamentally, well, I'd say technically three fundamentally different ways you can manage the libraries themselves. That's really the primary purpose of today's discussion is what's the best way to manage these things. The instantiated files, as long as you're managing your files correctly, either with Vault or without, that generally is the kind of thing you set up maybe once with your master project file. If you're using Vault, for sure, when you check in an assembly, they're going to go in, the references will be there, so they generally are going to take care of themselves. So really the question largely, as long as you've got the actual file management stuff sorted, is how should we manage the libraries? What's the best way to do that? And again, we have three options for this. They could be what I would call local Inventor managed, meaning you have copies of these IDCL files on your computer, or those IDCL files could be on the network. That would be the second way. So a shared location. The reason you would do that is because in addition to the standard libraries, we can also create custom libraries where we can publish our own content or copy standard content and modify that standard content. So there are benefits to having a shared location of some sort, either on a network with IDCL files or managed by the Vault server. The biggest benefit there is customizations are immediately available to everyone using the Content Center. So first one is local managed, the second network Inventor managed. The third would be letting your Vault or your Autodesk Data Management Server, your Vault server, manage those libraries. And it's important to understand that an ADMS can manage any version of Inventor Content Center library that could interact with that Vault. So a given IDCL file is going to be related to a given release of Inventor. The Vault server can manage any library for any version of Inventor that could connect to that Vault and use it. So in the case of 2021, that would be Inventor 2021 libraries, but also Inventor 2020 and Inventor 2019. Right. And there are lots of implications to how these things are managed. One of them would be when you go to upgrade. You only need to migrate or do anything in terms of upgrades with your custom Content Center libraries. Autodesk always releases new versions of the standard libraries for each new release of Inventor. The installation media itself includes IDCL files for the standard libraries. And for Vault managed libraries, there you would always download those. If you ever need to find where those are, you can always just Google Autodesk Inventor and then the release, say 2020, remote content libraries. Because if you're installing the Vault server software, for example, maybe you're installing Vault New or you're upgrading your Vault, the Vault installation media does not include the Content Center libraries for Inventor by default, because not everybody uses Inventor with Vault. And it's a few extra gigabytes worth of data to include all of those. So if you ever do need to include Content Center libraries with your Vault, you're always going to need to download those from Autodesk. And you can pick and choose which ones you use, and we'll talk a little in a minute about how you would actually, you know, attach one of these guys to your ADMS. Right? So again, for upgrades, only your custom libraries need to be migrated. If you're migrating with Inventor, if you're managing with Inventor alone, there's always just like a single step to migrate those custom Content Center libraries. You would use the Configure Libraries button on your project manager dialog, right? So if you open your projects dialog, there's a button here for Configure Content Center Libraries. And this is where you can always see explicitly where your installation of Inventor is looking for these things, and also see all of the libraries that your project file is expecting to access, right? Notice some of these are not available because I chose not to copy those to this local computer. And there are various buttons down here for updating libraries. You'll see a little exclamation point if something's out of date, for example. Right, so with Inventor, if you migrate to a new release, there's a single step migration to update one of your custom libraries for the new release. For Vault, there's a two-step process, because let's say you're using Inventor 2020 with Vault Managed Content Center libraries. The first thing you need to do is migrate the database schema itself on the ADMS console and make it available to Inventor 2021. That's just basically making the database file itself work with the new version of the Vault server. And then you still need to come to Inventor and migrate the actual contents of the database. And so you would still use that same migration or update tool if you're using the Vault to manage these libraries. So there's technically two steps, which you could consider that a downside, I would say, is an extra step. However, Autodesk has done a good job in recent versions of Vault. When you update a Vault server, if it detects that there are custom libraries associated with the server, it will give you a box saying these probably need to be migrated and copied to the new partition for the new version of Inventor. Do you want to go ahead and do that? So it's hard to miss at this point. If you're upgrading from a very old version of Inventor, or Vault, I should say, depending on if you're doing multiple migration steps, you know, that's something that could be missed, and there's some tricks, you know, there potentially, or some issues that could cause you trouble. But you know, I'm trying to remember, I think anything starting at least 2019 and newer, if you upgrade to that version, say 2019 and newer at least, it's going to prompt you to migrate those libraries when you do your Vault server migration. But those are the kind of things that you typically only need to worry about, again, when you're upgrading. So to me, yes, there's technically a small downside of managing those things with Vault, but that's really minimal. I think what it really comes down to, what's the best way to manage these things, is day-to-day use. And I kind of broke up the review of this into three different categories: performance, customization, and availability. Performance meaning when I come to place a Content Center file and I hit this button, how long does it take for this page to pop up? When I pick a given family, how long does it take for this dialog to pop up? How long does it take for it to appear on my cursor, right? How painful or easy is it for me to use this day in, day out, right? So performance is the first criteria. And when we're looking at locally managed Content Center libraries, that's going to be your best performance. There's really no question about it, because those files, the definitions, are local to your computer. So you're not going to get anything better than that. You're only limited essentially by your disk speed, CPU, right? So you're not going to get any better. Now, the second category would be customization. How easy is it to customize this content? But more importantly, how easy is it to make sure everyone in your environment using this custom content has access to the latest version of that custom content? Locally managed content center libraries just on your computer are by far the worst for this, no question, because you have your own copy of the libraries. And generally, everyone is going to be able to make edits to those if they want. And if your goal is to have standardized custom content for everyone to use, anytime someone adds custom content to a library somewhere, you've got to get those customizations to everybody. And there's no good way to sort of merge these things. And so if you want to have locally managed content and you want to customize that content, you essentially have to have a gatekeeper somewhere that is responsible for updating everything, and then make sure when you do those updates, everyone gets their local copy updated. It really becomes untenable pretty quickly if you want to do customization of content and you're keeping everything local. Now, if you're a single user, this is the best way. If you're the only person in your environment using Inventor, or if you just work at home and you're using Inventor to do design work, local's the best way, no question. But if you're in a group and you're going to customize content, it's really by far the worst way to manage it. Now, the third category is availability, not just how well does it perform, but can I get to it at all? Again, local is going to be by far the best, right? Because it's on your hard drive, so you can always get to it. So again, if you're the only person using Inventor in your environment, or if you're never planning to customize the content, then local is going to be the best. Now, your other option in the absence of Vault is managing it on a network somewhere. Basically having these IDCL files on a network location and pointing Inventor, again through your application options, to a network location for the desktop content. Right? And that does have some advantages, right? Performance is not going to be one of them, though, because now you're accessing these databases across the network. Now, if your network is very stable and you've got maybe gigabit, connectivity, and you're in the office, it's not bad, right? It's not going to be terrible. If your network is iffy, if you got limited connectivity, if you're not in the office, if you're working from home, say over a VPN, it's not going to be great. Now, it's better for customizing content because everyone in your org environment is pointing to the same set of files, and so whoever is allowed to make changes, when they make that change, everyone's going to see it at once. However, there are some drawbacks because you're essentially everyone's editing that same database file. Anyone who's allowed to make edits has to have permission to write to those files. And if you want to control who's allowed to publish or manage content in your custom libraries, that becomes an IT function, right? You have to manage file permissions to control who is allowed to modify those things. So it's better by far because at least everyone's working off the same page. But you then may have to get IT involved to determine who's allowed to write on that page. And again, availability kind of falls into performance as well. If your server goes down, you can't get to it. It may not be a big deal because maybe your other Inventor files were there too. So maybe you'd be down entirely. But latency makes both availability and especially performance much worse because you're connecting across a Windows file share to get this information. And again, if you're working from home, which a lot of us are these days, and probably for a while, unfortunately, you're going to have to be on the VPN if these things are stored on a network location. And performance is possibly really going to suffer. So if your goal is to customize your content library and you have multiple people using it, managing these IDCL files on a network is not going to be the best solution. And in fact, I think personally, managing them on a network, managing IDCL files just on a network share is the worst option, in my opinion. See, 2 thumbs down in this case. Worst case, only 1 thumb down when we're talking about locally managed, right? So there are ways to make the locally managed still work with customization, but the network managed, I think, is just really a lot of potential for trouble. So if your goal is to share content, custom content among multiple people, in my mind, the best option is going to be to manage it with a Vault server. Now, that doesn't mean you have to use Vault, right? You don't have to put your files in a Vault. An ADMS can serve just for Content Center management. You don't have to do your file management in Vault. So if you've decided this Vault thing's not for us, it's too complicated, we don't need it, but we do have custom content and we want to share that content easily with people, you may still want to install the ADMS somewhere, and you can use just Vault Basic for that and manage the content libraries with Vault, even if you're not managing the actual files there. Okay. So, but when it comes to the ADMS management performance, again, it's not going to be as good as locally managed IDCL files, but it can still be pretty good. It's a fundamentally different way of interacting with the Content Center that doesn't necessarily rely on server file share communications. It also should be generally more consistent. It is by far the best way to customize and to offer customization, because if you're going to use the Content Center, you do have to log into the Vault console or the Vault itself to use content. And there are 2 roles you can assign to users. One is Content Center Administrator, which would give you permission to create a library on the server. And the other is Content Center Editor, which would allow people to modify the Content Center. So that can become no longer necessarily an IT function. You don't have to control file access to an IDCL. Now you can log into the Vault in a couple different ways and just change somebody's role. And that's something that's very straightforward and can be done, you know, by any Vault administrator without needing to deal with file or folder permissions or Active Directory groups and, you know, cause a bunch of trouble there. Now, availability is still potentially a concern, especially because if you're working from home, you still have to be connected to a VPN. But again, it's a different means of communication with these databases. And so it's going to be less dependent on latency. And so in my mind, there are really 2 options. Either generally you're not customizing your content at all, or there's no real effective way to share libraries. And so you're always working locally, or you should be using your Vault server to manage these libraries. Those, in my mind, are really the 2 choices. So we've already talked a little bit about this. I got a little bit ahead of myself. But the Inventor application options is where you would go and set this, be it you know, using desktop content, in which case you would browse that location, or using the Vault server. When you are using the Vault server, or when you change this, it's going to ask you to log into a Vault server somewhere. So you need credentials to do that. It's going to ask you to log into a Vault server to get to these libraries the next time you, say, try to place from Content Center, for example. Again, your project file would dictate where the instantiated files go. In a Vault environment, typically we would, put the Content Center files, parallel to our Inventor workspace. I think personally that's generally a good idea. Keep in mind this Content Center files location cannot and should not be inside your Vault or your Inventor workspace, but it should be somewhere that can be accessed by everybody. So if you're working in a multi-user situation, unless you're the only user, you absolutely are going to want to redirect your Content Center files location, where the actual instantiated files go, to someplace besides everyone's documents folder. Right. So let's take a quick look at how you might manage these libraries within ADMS. Right now, I have no libraries associated with this particular Vault server. If I want to use one of the standard libraries, again, I would probably Google, in case Autodesk Inventor 2021 remote content libraries, and then I can download one or more of these exe files. Now these are all exes, but these are ultimately SQL Server databases, and so you're going to have to do something besides just download it and attach. The way this works is once you've downloaded the exe, when you run it, this is actually a self-extracting zip file. And it's going to extract another zip file. This zip file actually has the SQL Server database files. But there's also an exe and a batch file. The idea with this is this little program here will automate the attachment of the libraries to your ADMS. So this is something you have to run on your Vault server. So you wouldn't run it from a client. You have to connect to your Vault server. You also would not have the data management server console open when you run this. And you would always want to run the batch file, because the batch file is going to automatically attach all of these things, but it also runs this library setup utility with the correct command line switches to make sure things get attached right. But you may need to modify this batch file. You'll notice there's, a lot of stuff going on down here, but right here at the very top, this is where you would provide information about your Vault environment so that the utility can actually connect to the Vault server, actually launch the ADMS console, and attach these libraries. So you might need to specify a Vault username and a password. If you're not using the default SA account with the default password for your SQL Server instance for Vault, you might need to specify that information as well. And if you use Windows authentication, if you're using Vault Professional and you use Active Directory to log into Vault, rather than specify a Vault username and password, you could just set this to 1 and it'll use Windows authentication, meaning whoever you're logged in as and running this batch file as is the user that would log into Vault and do this work. So it is relatively straightforward to get these libraries attached to your Vault server. So again, we had none attached. You would start by downloading all of the exes for all of the libraries you would want, run each of those exes, and that will get you this folder full of zip files with a batch file and this exe. And then you just run the batch file, and you'll see a bar march across the screen. It can take a while to do because it has to extract all of these, and then it has to do the attachment, and then it has to do some migration. So I'm not going to do it right now because we'll just be sitting here watching the bar go across the screen, and nobody likes to do that. But I'll show you if you would rather attach them separately and manually, you can always just extract the zip file to get the MDF and the LDF files. And then you would usually put those files into the same folder as your existing Vault databases, right? So maybe in this data folder right here, which for whatever reason, Windows is not wanting to let me look into any of these folders. So let me relaunch Explorer here. Let's try this one more time. Now, you don't have to put them in this folder. It's just best practice, and it does make it easiest. That's really interesting. I think it's probably because I'm not running this as administrator. It's not going to want to let me get into that folder for some reason. So we'll just attach it from where they are for now. So I can manually attach a library. If I go to the advanced, I can browse anywhere on my computer, right? So I could go to Content Library 2021, find that custom library. It's going to fill out the rest of this. It's assuming the LDF file's in the same folder. It pulls the name off of it. Press OK, and it attaches and then does a little migration. And now this library is available for use by anyone who's connecting to this Vault server and those people that have their Inventor application set to use the ADMS or the Vault server for the content. Now, if you need to create your own read-write library, you can just right-click, create library, press OK, and now, just like that, you will have your own custom Inventor Content Center library that you can now publish content to. So it's very straightforward, I think, to manage these things. Really, the hardest part is getting the standard content attached the first time. But again, all you need to do is download the EXEs to the Vault server, run them to extract the files, and then run the batch file, and it can do that all for you. Or if we help you set up your Vault server, that's one of the things we would typically ask, are you using the Content Center? And if so, do you want the Vault server to manage it? And if so, we would make sure that these things all got attached properly. The only other thing is when you go to migrate a Vault, let's take a look at, say, I've got a system here with a few more libraries on it. You'll notice I have AI 2021, and you'll notice this idea of a partition. I also have AI 19 on a different partition. This is how the Vault server handles its capability of communicating with multiple versions of Inventor. This library would be served to any Inventor 2021 applications connecting for content. This library would be served to any Inventor 2019 connecting. When you go to migrate, you'll typically get a dialog box saying, these are old libraries, do you want to make them available to the new version of Inventor? If you don't get that, or for some reason you say no, you can always copy an existing custom library to a new partition. So if I wanted to make this 2019 library available for 2020, I could just copy to Inventor 2020. That's going to duplicate the database and migrate it, at least for Vault server use, to make sure that it could be communicated with via Inventor 2020. Well, that's the first step. The second step, when you go to migration, would then be to connect to the Vault in Inventor. And then in the projects dialog, at that point, you would see a prompt that the library needs to be migrated. Right? So Vault server, And when I go to projects, this button here, what you might see is some exclamation points here saying this library is available, but it needs to be updated. So check any boxes for libraries that you want to use here and update. At that point, it will update. Now, once you check boxes in this dialog, you've got to hit OK to save the changes. But now I can hit this button after I hit save, and it's going to see here are the libraries that need to be migrated. It'll go through the process. If it, for whatever reason, if it runs into any problems in the migration, it'll let you know what failed. I don't think I personally have ever seen a failure in this, but once you do that, those custom libraries are now ready to be used. If we look at it again, now the little exclamation point went away. So, and again, this is the kind of thing that if we help a customer with an upgrade, we typically will help them work out as well. All right. So one last thing here, because we talked about managing the libraries, which is the most complex part of this whole thing. Managing the instantiated content center files is much simpler in my mind. If you're not using Vault, and again, we're talking about the instantiated ones, the ones that once you place a content center component, the part file gets created, goes to a folder somewhere. If you're more than one person using the content center file, you always want to map the instantiated content center files folder to some shared location, right? If you're using more than one Inventor project file, consider redirecting that via the application options instead. So again, the two ways: application options, file, default content center files. If you use more than one Inventor project file in your environment, this might be the better way to go. That way, no matter what project file is active, they're always getting in that shared location. If you only have a single Inventor project file, you can always remap it in the project file itself under the folder options here. And regardless of whether you're saving your content center, all of your files local, some people do work only on their computer. I would still recommend that you pick a different location from the default for these instantiated files, because it's very easy to not realize that they're going into your documents folder. And then if the documents folder disappears somehow, or you move to a new computer, you could lose some of your files. So I personally would make sure that my content center files were going somewhere that I knew they belonged. Right? Now, if you are using Vault, it's a much easier answer to this problem because they're going to go into the Vault. Vault, by default, inherently will manage the content center files. When you check in an Inventor assembly that uses content, they're going to go in the Vault somehow. If your Vault's not configured properly, you probably won't even be able to check them in. So that should be sorted. However, Vault 2021.1, this latest update for Vault 2021, added some new functionality that I want to make you aware of, because you may hear about it and you may be tempted to use it for some of your content center files, especially if you've got issues with those for whatever reason. And that's the idea of exclude paths. Now this can be, in the right situation, incredibly useful functionality. What it lets you do is tell the Inventor Vault add-in that certain locations referenced by Inventor should be ignored in terms of checking files into Vault. So if a file is found or not found, if it's in one of these exclude paths, don't bother checking it in. Now, the intent of this behavior is for things like like giant Revit files you're referencing or huge point clouds that don't really need to go in the vault, there wouldn't be any real lasting harm to the Inventor assembly if you didn't have those files, let's say. And you don't want them to go into Vault because they're huge or they don't need to be managed. In that sense, this idea of exclude paths is great. Keep in mind, this is an administrator level setting. You have to be an administrator, and this is for the entire Vault. So even though I'm modifying this right here inside Inventor, if I add an exclude path here, this is for everybody, right? But what we'll see here, because in this case, I added my Content Center files location. If I put a Content Center file here, when I go to check this in, on my Vault tab, I get a little red circle with a minus sign in it, basically saying this is within the exclude path. It's not going to be included in the check-in. So I actually could save this file, this assembly, and when I go to check it in, it's not going to take the file with it. And I do get warnings, right? So it's not like you can do this on accident. Now, again, this is a good idea for maybe things like point clouds, or if you've got issues with legacy textures or something, it can also be helpful there. Again, a texture missing is usually not going to, destroy the design intent of something. But I strongly recommend you do not use this for things like Content Center files. Content Center files are integral to an Inventor assembly. They really need to be associated with that assembly. And so I only mention this functionality to make sure that you understand it's a bad idea for Content Center files. All right, and with that, I think we'll open up the floor for more questions. So we have one that's come in so far. The question, we use ADMS console. In the case of an upgrade, how should we go about migrating our standard instantiated files? That's a really good question. And I think I had that on a slide and I totally skipped it, right way back here. That's a really good question. Instantiated file migration. Should we migrate our instantiated files? The answer there is maybe, right? And that's a really good question regardless when you're upgrading your Vault is, do we need to migrate all of our actual Inventor files every time? Autodesk's official position that I've seen on the Knowledge Network is not necessarily. If you choose to migrate the Inventor version of every file in your Vault, every time you upgrade your Vault, you're going to be creating at least one new version of every file every time you upgrade. And that's going to grow the size of your file store. It's going to grow the number of versions. If you use file lifecycle management, depending on how you do the migration, it could lead to multiple versions and multiple versions within a given revision. It gets a little sticky. So whether or not you migrate the Inventor files, Content Center files or not, really comes down typically to performance. When you open an Inventor file from a previous release in Inventor, it will migrate those files in memory when you open them. So you don't necessarily have to migrate everything to use them with the new release. However, that in-memory migration causes a performance hit. If you work with small assemblies or individual parts, it'll be virtually unnoticeable. If you work with thousands of parts in an assembly and none of them are migrated, you could definitely notice a performance hit by migrating those files in memory every time. Another byproduct of that is if you're migrating the files in memory, they're technically changing in memory, and that's going to potentially cause some issues, if nothing else, with what you see in the Vault browser in Inventor, because it's going to see these files as having changed. Now, there are some application options. On the Save tab, basically, should you be prompted to save a file based on how it might have changed in memory? By default these days, you're not prompted to save the file by default for migration. Right, so that can ease things. Also, technically, it is possible if you're using Vault, even if you don't have a file checked out, if the file has changed in memory, you can still save the file locally without checking it out. You may have seen this before. If you hit the save button, and it's hard to duplicate on demand, but if you hit the save button, it might say multiple files that have to be saved. And then if you say yes to all, you might see a little message next to the file that says write enable not checked out from Vault or something like that. That is a way that you could migrate those files, the disk version of those files, your local copy at least, so that while you're opening it, it's performing okay. So that's always another option too. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, but the short answer is it's not trivial. Generally, you would want to migrate your standard files that you're using all the time. If your use case is we do sort of project-based stuff, and once we've done with a project, we don't touch the files again, maybe ever, if not for a long time, probably don't need to migrate those. But Content Center files, not necessarily a bad idea. And standard components, not necessarily a bad idea. And there is a migrate from Vault task in the Inventor task scheduler, which can help you to migrate vaulted files. So migrate files, if we were to create a new migrate files, there is migrate from Vault. So this can help you get the files checked out, migrated, and checked back in. If you're using file-based life cycles and the files are locked, you may need to either change their lifecycle state or you may use a special user that can modify the files while they're locked. Okay. Next question, how do I access my Vault server? Good question. So what you see here, this application, the Data Management Server console, this is an application that's only on the Vault server. You have to log into you have to log in via like the Windows desktop on the server to get access to that, right? And so normally I would use something like Remote Desktop and log into like my Vault server. It's going to ask you for login credentials. These are Windows credentials. Once you do that, and technically what you're seeing on the screen here is actually a remote desktop connection. I'm logged in from another computer for presentation purposes. But you'll have to have your Windows account will have to have permissions to log into that server. Not all IT groups give users permission to log into their Vault servers. So you may either need to ask IT to give you those credentials or work with IT to have them log in and then either tell them what to do or work with them to say get your libraries attached or created. Right, so it's been a few more minutes and I've not seen any other questions come in, so I think we'll leave it there. I really appreciate everyone's time today. Thanks for attending. Ashley, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Forrest. Yeah, I'll let everyone know that if you do think of questions later, you can simply reply to that confirmation or reminder email that you receive from us, and we can get those to the right person for you. Again, there will be a short survey pop up as we close down today, and also you will receive an email tomorrow with a link for the recording of today's presentation. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for attending.